My son and his wife refused to take me home from hospital after my surgery, but that night My name is Leonard, 73 years old. I spent 40 years as a construction foreman, building homes for countless families, while raising my son Thomas alone after losing my wife too young. Last month I had major back surgery that required family support during recovery. I never expected the moment when Thomas and his wife Stephanie refused to take me home from the hospital, claiming they were too busy, despite living just 15 minutes away. A nurse witnessed everything. Before I continue this heartbreaking story, let me know where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories about finding dignity after betrayal. After Marie died from cancer, I found myself a widower with a 7-year-old son who needed me more than ever. Those early years were the hardest. I would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, make breakfast for Thomas, pack his lunch, and drop him off at my sister-in-law's house before heading to the construction site. Most days I worked double shifts to make ends meet, coming home exhausted, but still finding energy to help Thomas with homework or throw a baseball in the backyard. Many friends suggested I should start dating again, find a new mother for Thomas. I went on exactly 2 dates in those early years before deciding that my son needed all of my attention. Looking back, maybe that was a mistake, putting all my emotional eggs in one basket. But at the time, it seemed like the only right choice. Thomas was a good kid, smart, and generally well-behaved. He had Marie's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. I kept her memory alive for him, telling stories about how she could name every constellation in the night sky, or how she once rescued a nest of baby rabbits after their mother was killed by a neighborhood cat. Thomas soaked up these stories like a sponge, always asking for more details about the mother he barely remembered. When Thomas was accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, I nearly burst with pride. I had been saving every spare penny for 15 years to make this possible. The night before he left for college, we sat on the porch drinking root beer, a tradition from his childhood. "Dad," he said, staring into his bottle, "I know how much you sacrificed for me." I shrugged it off the way men of my generation tend to do. That is what fathers are supposed to do. "No," Thomas insisted. "Not every dad works themselves to the bone like you did. I promise I will make it worth it." I believed him then. I truly did. Thomas met Stephanie during his junior year of college. She was studying business administration, ambitious and sharp as a tack. The first time he brought her home for Thanksgiving, I noticed how she appraised our modest house, her eyes lingering on the dated furniture and the patched spot in the kitchen linoleum. But she was polite and brought an expensive bottle of wine, making an effort to ask about my work and my hobbies. After their graduation, I helped them with the down payment on their first house, a starter home in a decent neighborhood about 45 minutes from me. I had been saving for a fishing boat in my retirement, but seeing them get established seemed more important. Thomas appeared genuinely grateful, giving me a bear hug when I handed him the check. "This means the world to us, Dad," he said. "We will have you over for dinner every Sunday." Those Sunday dinners lasted about 6 months before they became every other week, then once a month, then special occasions only. Thomas got a job at a marketing firm downtown, and Stephanie started climbing the corporate ladder at an investment company. They were busy building careers, I told myself. That is normal. I retired at 68 when my back started giving me trouble after 4 decades of physical labor. I had decent savings and a small pension, enough to live comfortably, if not luxuriously. I looked forward to spending more time with Thomas, maybe even grandchildren someday. Instead, I found myself increasingly on the periphery of their lives. They moved to an upscale neighborhood with manicured lawns and 3-car garages. Their new friends were executives and doctors. When I visited their new house for the first time, Thomas gave me a quick tour that somehow managed to skip his home office and the formal living room, as if those spaces were too good for my weathered work boots to tread upon. The Thanksgiving dinner incident was when I first felt the sting of deliberate exclusion. Thomas and Stephanie were hosting several couples from their social circle, a surgeon and his wife, a law partner, and his husband, a local news anchor. I arrived early to help with preparations, bringing my famous pecan pie that Thomas had loved since childhood. "Oh, Dad," Stephanie said when I entered their gleaming kitchen, "we have a caterer handling everything this year." When dinner was served, I found myself seated at a small table in the kitchen, while everyone else gathered around the formal dining table visible through the doorway. Thomas brought me a plate and squeezed my shoulder. "Sorry, Dad. We are just tight on space at the main table with Stephanie's important work connections." I nodded and ate my turkey in silence, listening to the laughter and conversation flowing from the other room. My back problems worsened as the years passed. Decades of lifting, bending, and falling had taken their toll on my spine. I started using a cane but tried to hide how much pain I was really in. The few times I visited Thomas and Stephanie, I noticed their poorly disguised impatience when I moved too slowly or needed to rest. During one rare visit to their house for Thomas's 40th birthday, I collapsed while trying to get up from their low modern sofa. The shooting pain was so intense I could not breathe for several seconds. Thomas helped me up with an expression that looked more embarrassed than concerned. Stephanie stepped out of the room to make a phone call, her voice drifting back. "We might need to wrap up early. Something came up with Dad." That was when I finally decided to get the surgery my doctor had been recommending for years. The specialist explained it was a serious spinal procedure with a difficult recovery period, but it offered the best chance to reduce my chronic pain. When I told Thomas about my decision, he and Stephanie visited me at the hospital the day before surgery, bringing flowers and magazines. "Do not worry about anything," Thomas assured me, patting my hand. "We will be here for you during recovery." Stephanie nodded. "Family first," she said, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I believed them. Why would I not? He was my son, my only child, the person I had sacrificed everything for, the person who had once promised to make it all worth it. The surgery lasted over 5 hours. When I woke up groggy from anesthesia, a nurse named Angela was adjusting my IV. She had kind eyes and efficient hands, explaining that the doctor would be in shortly to discuss how everything went. The first question I asked was whether Thomas had called. "Not yet," Angela said, checking her watch. "But visiting hours just started. I am sure they will be here soon." My son and his wife did not come that day, or the next. Thomas called briefly, explaining they were swamped at work, but would definitely be there to take me home when I was discharged. The hospital staff had made it clear that I would need assistance during the first 2 weeks of recovery. Help with meals, monitoring my incision site, assistance with basic mobility. I could not possibly manage alone in my small ranch house with its narrow bathroom and 3 front steps. The day before my scheduled discharge, I called Thomas multiple times. The first 4 calls went straight to voicemail. On the 5th attempt, he finally answered, sounding distracted. "Dad, I am in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" I could hear voices in the background, the clinking of glasses. "Thomas, I am being discharged tomorrow morning. The doctor says I need someone to stay with me for at least the first week. Remember, we talked about this." A pause. Right. Let me check with Stephanie about our schedule. I will call you back." He did not call back. The morning of my discharge, a hospital orderly helped me dress and pack my few belongings. The physical therapist reviewed exercises I would need to do at home. The pharmacist explained my pain medication schedule. By 11 a.m., I was sitting in a wheelchair in the hospital lobby waiting for Thomas to arrive. 1 hour passed, then 2. I called repeatedly, getting only voicemail. At 2:30, when I was considering taking a taxi to a hotel, Thomas and Stephanie finally walked through the sliding doors. They were not rushing, not looking worried about being 3 hours late. Thomas was checking emails on his phone while Stephanie glanced at her watch repeatedly. "Sorry we are late, Dad," Thomas said without looking up from his screen. Traffic was a nightmare. The hospital discharge coordinator approached with my paperwork and instructions for home care. She began explaining the requirements to Thomas and Stephanie, who exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Actually," Thomas said, interrupting the coordinator, "we have run into a bit of an issue with the timing here." I felt a chill run through me as Stephanie stepped forward, her professional demeanor in place, the same one she probably used for difficult clients. "Leonard, we simply cannot take you home with us right now. Our schedules are completely full with work commitments. Thomas has that conference in Phoenix next week, and I have the Richardson account presentation. Plus, our guest room is being renovated." The discharge coordinator looked stunned. "Your father cannot be alone right now. He needs assistance with basic tasks and medication management." Thomas shifted his weight, not quite meeting my eyes. "We thought maybe there was some kind of service the hospital could arrange, or maybe a short-term care facility." I sat in that wheelchair, a dull roar filling my ears, as my son, my only child, whom I had raised alone, whom I had given everything to, explained why he could not be bothered to help me when I needed him most. Angela, the nurse who had cared for me after surgery, was passing through the lobby on her way to her shift. She stopped recognizing me and approached just in time to hear Stephanie say, "Besides, our house has too many stairs. It simply would not work." The lie was transparent. Their house had a ground-floor guest suite specifically designed for aging parents, a selling point Stephanie had mentioned when they purchased it. Angela's face registered shock, then barely concealed anger. "Excuse me, but your father just underwent major spinal surgery. He cannot be left alone right now." Thomas had the decency to look slightly ashamed, but Stephanie merely checked her watch again. "We understand that, but we have commitments we simply cannot break. Perhaps you can recommend a facility that takes Medicare." The implication was clear. They would not even pay for proper care. I felt humiliation burning in my chest, struggling to maintain composure in the busy hospital lobby. These were not strangers abandoning me. This was my son, my flesh and blood, the child I had sacrificed everything for. Angela placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of support that nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. "We need to figure something out," the discharge coordinator said firmly. "Mr. Leonard cannot leave without proper care arrangements." "We really have to go," Stephanie said, already turning toward the door. "We have a dinner with the Andersons at 7. The hospital must have social services that handle these situations." Thomas hesitated, then leaned down awkwardly as if to hug me. I turned my face away slightly, and he settled for patting my shoulder instead. "Call us when you get settled, Dad," he said, as if this were a normal parting, as if he were not abandoning me in my hour of need. Then they were gone, walking out the sliding doors without looking back, leaving me sitting in a wheelchair, surrounded by strangers who showed more concern than my own son. The discharge coordinator sighed heavily. "Let me call social services. This happens sometimes, unfortunately." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Angela squeezed my shoulder gently before heading to her unit, her expression troubled. For the next few hours, I sat in the social worker's office as she made calls trying to find a solution. A temporary care facility would take 2 days to process admission. Home health aides were booked solid. I had neighbors, but none close enough to provide the level of care I needed. The social worker looked increasingly frustrated as option after option fell through. Is there anyone else we can call, any other family members? I shook my head. My wife died 25 years ago. My sister-in-law passed last year. There is just Thomas. Just Thomas. The son who had left me sitting in a hospital when I needed him most. The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty at 5 p.m., caught in that lull between the day shift's late lunch and the evening staff's dinner break. I sat at a corner table, a cup of lukewarm coffee between my hands, contemplating my non-existent options. The social worker had reluctantly agreed to let me stay one more night, while they continued searching for placement options. Leonard. I looked up to see Angela, the nurse, from my floor, still in her scrubs, but with a jacket thrown over them, apparently having just finished her shift. Mind if I join you? I gestured to the empty chair across from me, grateful for the company, even as embarrassment burned in my chest. Angela sat down, placing her lunch bag on the table. I cannot stop thinking about what happened earlier, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. In 20 years of nursing, I have seen some families do some pretty awful things, but that was... She shook her head, apparently unable to find words strong enough. He was not always like this, I said, feeling the strange need to defend my son despite everything. He was a good kid. Kids are supposed to grow into decent adults, Angela replied, especially when they have had good parents. She studied my face for a moment. And I can tell you were a good father. I swallowed hard against the lump forming in my throat. Apparently not good enough. Angela reached across the table and placed her hand on mine, a simple human connection that nearly undid me. I might have a temporary solution, she said after a moment. My brother Frank owns several rental properties around the city. He mentioned yesterday that he just had a tenant move out of a small one-bedroom apartment. It is nothing fancy, but it is on the ground floor, and it is clean. I cannot impose. It is not imposing. He would charge you rent, but I know he would make it fair. And it would just be until you are back on your feet or find something more permanent. The kindness of this virtual stranger compared to the callousness of my own son made my vision blur with unshed tears. Why would you do this for me? I asked, my voice rough. Angela's expression softened. Because it is the right thing to do. And because my own father died alone in a nursing home while my brother and I were overseas with the military. No one deserves to be abandoned when they are vulnerable. An hour later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of Angela's sensible sedan while she called her brother on the car's speakerphone. Frank's voice filled the car, gruff but not unkind. The place is nothing special, but it is clean. Previous tenant was an old army buddy who got transferred to Arizona. I was going to spend the weekend painting before listing it, but it is livable as is. Thanks, Frank. We will be there in about 15 minutes. Roger that. Coffee's on. Frank turned out to be a barrel-chested man in his 60s, with a salt and pepper beard and the ramrod straight posture of a career military man. He greeted us at the door of a small but well-maintained apartment complex, dressed in paint-spattered jeans and a faded Vietnam veteran cap. Frank Kowalski, he said, extending a calloused hand. Angela tells me you need a place to recover. Leonard Miller, I replied, shaking his hand from my seated position in the wheelchair the hospital had insisted I use for transport. I appreciate you considering this on such short notice. Frank waved away my thanks. Apartment's just sitting empty anyway. Rather have someone in it, especially someone who needs a hand. The apartment was small but functional. A combined living room and kitchenette, a bedroom just large enough for a full-sized bed, and a bathroom with grab bars already installed by the toilet and shower. Previous tenant had mobility issues too, Frank explained, noticing my glance at the grab bars. Left those upgrades in place figuring they might be useful for future tenants. We discussed rent, Frank naming a figure well below market rate that I could manage on my retirement income, and he produced a simple month-to-month lease from a folder. No need to lock yourself into anything long-term, just until you figure out your next steps. As Angela helped me settle in, bringing in the small bag of possessions from the hospital and a few groceries she had picked up, Frank made a phone call in the hallway. He returned with news that a medical supply company would deliver a shower chair and raised toilet seat the following morning. Friend of mine from the VFW runs the place, he explained. Said he would rush the order through. That evening, after Angela reluctantly left for home and her own family, Frank brought over a simple dinner of rotisserie chicken and roasted potatoes. Not much of a cook, he admitted, but it is hot and it is edible. As he turned to leave, I found myself asking, "Why are you helping me? You do not even know me." Frank paused in the doorway, considering the question. When I came back from Vietnam, a lot of folks looked right through me. My own uncle refused to let me stay with him, said he did not want my issues under his roof, and he tapped his prosthetic leg, which I had not noticed before. Angela and I learned early that family is not always blood, and blood is not always family. Get some rest, Leonard. Things usually look different in the morning. With that cryptic advice, he left me alone in the unfamiliar apartment, my medication beginning to pull me toward sleep, despite the turmoil in my mind and heart. That first night in the apartment was one of the darkest of my life. The pain medication wore off around 2 a.m., leaving me awake and hurting in an unfamiliar bed. I reached for the pill bottle on the nightstand, but my fingers sent it tumbling to the floor, small white tablets scattering across the linoleum. Physically, the pain from my surgery was intense, a burning, stabbing sensation that radiated from my lower back down through my legs. But it was nothing compared to the emotional agony that kept replaying in my mind the image of Thomas and Stephanie walking away from me in that hospital lobby, not even looking back to see if I would be okay. In the darkness of that strange bedroom, memories flooded back unbidden. Thomas at 8 years old, face streaked with tears, after a nightmare climbing into my bed, seeking comfort. Thomas at 12, proudly showing me his science fair project, a working model of a construction crane that we had built together in the garage. Thomas at 18 in his graduation cap and gown, hugging me fiercely and whispering, "We did it, Dad." Had I done something wrong along the way? Had I failed him, somehow taught him the wrong lessons about family and obligation? Or had the ambitious, status-conscious world he now inhabited with Stephanie simply erased the values I thought I had instilled? My phone buzzed on the nightstand, Thomas's name lighting up the screen. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe he had reconsidered, realized the magnitude of his abandonment. "Hello?" My voice sounded strange even to my own ears. "Dad, hey." Thomas sounded distracted, voices and music audible in the background. "Just checking in to see if the hospital got you situated somewhere." "The hospital did not situate me anywhere," I replied, unable to keep the bitterness from my tone. "A nurse and her brother helped me find temporary housing." "Oh, good. That is good." He cleared his throat. "Look, I know today was not ideal, but you have to understand our position. We simply cannot put our lives on hold right now. Stephanie has that big client she is wooing, and I have the conference next week." As he continued listing excuses, I could clearly hear the clink of glasses and laughter in the background. Not the sounds of a work commitment, but a social gathering. The very dinner party with the Andersons they had been rushing to attend, while abandoning me at the hospital. "We will definitely come visit soon, though," Thomas was saying. "Maybe next weekend, if things calm down at work." "Do not bother," I said quietly. What was that, Dad, you are breaking up? I said, do not bother. The force of my words sent a spike of pain through my back, making me gasp. Dad, are you okay? No. Thomas, I am not okay. I just had major surgery, and my only son left me sitting in a wheelchair at the hospital because he and his wife were too busy with a dinner party to help me. That is not fair. Life is not fair. I learned that when your mother died and left me to raise you alone. But I stepped up. I did what needed to be done because that is what family does. There was silence on the other end, then muffled sounds, as though Thomas had covered the phone to speak to someone else. When he came back on the line, his voice was tighter, defensive. Look, I cannot talk about this right now. We have guests. I will call you tomorrow, and we can discuss this when you are feeling more reasonable. The call ended before I could respond. I stared at the dark screen, a hollow feeling expanding in my chest, until it seemed to consume everything. I tried to sit up, intending to somehow retrieve my scattered medication from the floor, but the movement sent excruciating pain shooting through my spine. My vision tunneled, going gray at the edges, and I fell awkwardly half off the bed, unable to catch myself. I landed hard on my side, the impact driving the air from my lungs and sending fresh waves of agony through my surgical site. For several terrifying moments, I could not breathe, could not move, could only lie there on the cold floor, trapped in a body that had betrayed me as surely as my son had. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain sometimes receding to a dull roar, sometimes returning with such intensity that I heard myself making sounds I did not recognize as human. I tried calling out, but the neighboring apartments were silent, occupied by people who did not know me, who would not recognize my voice even if they heard it. At some point, I managed to drag myself a few inches toward the living room, where my phone had fallen, but the effort cost me consciousness again. When I came to, pale gray light was filtering through the blinds, dawn breaking on what might be my last day if I could not reach help. The irony did not escape me, that I might die alone on the floor of a strange apartment after a lifetime of building homes for other families, including the son who had abandoned me. The thought gave me a surge of anger, and anger gave me strength. I began the slow, agonizing process of dragging myself toward the living room once more, using my forearms to pull my body forward inch by painful inch. It took nearly 30 minutes to cover the 10 feet to where my phone lay. When I finally reached it, my fingers were trembling so badly I could barely operate the screen. I had to make a choice about who to call. Thomas was my son, my only blood relative. But after a moment's consideration, I scrolled past his name and called Frank instead. Frank arrived within 15 minutes of my call, using his master key to let himself in when I could not reach the door. He found me on the living room floor, still unable to get up, dried blood caking the back of my hospital gown, where several stitches had torn. Jesus, Leonard, he muttered, already on his phone calling his sister. Hang tight, buddy. Help is coming. While waiting for Angela, Frank gently slid a pillow under my head and covered me with a throw blanket from the couch. He made no attempt to move me, understanding that could cause more damage. Should we call an ambulance? He asked, his weathered face creased with concern. No hospitals. I whispered, the memory of being abandoned there still too raw. Please. Frank nodded, understanding without needing explanation. Angela is a registered nurse. Let her take a look first, then we will decide. He disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a glass of water and a straw. The simple kindness of helping me take a few sips nearly undid my composure. Angela arrived shortly after, still in her pajamas, with a jacket thrown over them, carrying her medical bag. Her professional demeanor took over as she examined me, checking vital signs and gently inspecting my surgical wound. "Some stitches have torn, but the incision itself is not compromised," she concluded. "I can clean and dress it here, but you will need to see your surgeon in the next day or two for proper repair." Between the two of them, they carefully helped me onto the couch, positioning pillows to support my back and legs. Angela administered pain medication from my scattered pills that Frank had gathered, then cleaned and dressed my wound with supplies from her bag. "What happened?" Frank asked as Angela worked. I told them about Thomas's late-night call, the party sounds in the background, contradicting his work excuse, my fall while trying to reach my medication. "I spent the night on the floor." I admitted, shame coloring my voice despite knowing none of this was my fault. "I could not get up." Angela's hands stilled momentarily, her expression hardening. "You could have developed hypothermia or gone into shock from the pain. Why did not you call one of us immediately?" The question caught me off guard. The truth was, I had spent decades handling problems alone, never wanting to burden others. Asking for help simply was not in my nature, especially from people who were still practically strangers. "I did not want to be a bother," I finally said. Frank made a sound somewhere between a snort and a laugh. "That right there is the problem with men our age, Leonard. We would rather die alone on the floor than bother someone by asking for help." By mid-morning, I was clean medicated and settled back in bed with a proper hospital-style tray table next to me, holding water medication and a simple breakfast Frank had prepared. Angela had called in to take a personal day from the hospital, insisting on monitoring me for at least the next 12 hours to ensure no complications developed. "I cannot take advantage of your kindness like this," I protested. "You are not taking advantage," Angela replied firmly. "This is what human beings are supposed to do for each other." Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Frank opened it to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, holding a covered dish. "Martha Williams' apartment 4C, she introduced herself. Frank mentioned we had a new neighbor who was recovering from surgery. I brought some homemade chicken soup. Before I could properly thank her, another knock came. This time it was a tall black man with dignified gray at his temples, introducing himself as Harold Washington from across the hall. "Vietnam, 68 to 70, he said, noticing Frank's veteran cap. "Heard from Frank you needed some wheels. Thought this might help." He wheeled in a comfortable-looking office chair with armrests. "Better than a walker for getting around the apartment while you heal. When you are ready for outside, I have a wheelchair we can dust off." Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of residents stopped by, not intruding, just briefly introducing themselves and offering specific help. A retired pharmacist promised to organize my medication schedule. A young teacher offered to pick up groceries when she did her own shopping. An elderly widower simply stated he played chess every Wednesday evening in the community room if I felt up to joining once I was mobile. By evening, I was overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers who seemed to instinctively understand what I needed. Not just physical assistance, but human connection, a sense of community. As the sun was setting, a young woman in her 30s arrived, introducing herself as Julia Frank's daughter. "Dad mentioned you might need some help getting your affairs in order," she said, setting down a leather portfolio on the kitchen table. "I am a paralegal with Henderson and Marks. No charge, just helping out a neighbor." Julia was efficient and thorough, helping me organize my medical paperwork, insurance documents, and follow-up appointments. As she sorted through the folder of papers I had brought from the hospital, her expression suddenly changed, brow furrowing, as she pulled out a document I did not recognize. "Mr. Miller, when did you sign this power of attorney?" I adjusted my glasses, looking at the paper she held. "I do not recall signing that." "It gives your son Thomas broad powers over your financial and medical decisions," she said, her professional demeanor sharpening. It is dated 3 days ago, right before your surgery. A vague memory surfaced. Thomas bringing some routine paperwork to my hospital room while I was anxious about the upcoming procedure, telling me it was just standard forms the hospital needed. I had signed without reading, carefully trusting my son completely. Julia continued examining my financial documents, her frown deepening. Have you checked your bank accounts recently? Not since before the surgery. Why? She turned her laptop toward me, showing me the online banking portal she had helped me log into. Several large withdrawals had been made in the past week. Money transferred from my retirement savings into an account I did not recognize. $10,000 2 days ago, $15,000 yesterday. Julia noted, her voice carefully neutral. Do you recognize these transactions? The room seemed to tilt slightly as the implications sank in. My own son had not just abandoned me physically. He had been systematically draining my accounts while I was vulnerable, using a power of attorney I had unwittingly signed. We need to revoke this immediately, Julia said, already pulling forms from her portfolio. And I strongly suggest we freeze your accounts until we can determine the full extent of the withdrawals. Frank, who had been quietly making coffee in the kitchenette, placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. I know this is a lot to take in, Leonard, but you need to protect yourself right now. He is my son, I whispered, still struggling to comprehend the betrayal. My only child. Yes, Frank said gently. And that makes this harder. But it does not change what needs to be done. That night, after everyone had gone and I lay awake in the quiet apartment, I felt something shift inside me. A painful but necessary severing. For decades, I had defined myself primarily as Thomas's father, measuring my worth by his success and happiness. Now I needed to redefine myself, to find value beyond that single relationship that had seemingly failed us both. I thought of the apartment residents who had come by throughout the day, strangers offering kindness without obligation or expectation. I thought of Frank and Angela, who had quite literally picked me up when I had fallen. Perhaps family could be something you found rather than something you were born into. As painful as this revelation was, it also carried a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in decades, I was responsible only for myself, free to make choices based solely on my own needs and desires. It was terrifying, but also oddly exhilarating. I fell asleep thinking of Frank's words, family is not always blood, and blood is not always family. 2 weeks passed in a blur of recovery, physical therapy exercises, and getting to know my new neighbors. The small apartment complex turned out to be primarily occupied by seniors and a few younger people with connections to the older residents. It had a modest community room where many gathered for coffee each morning, and a small courtyard with benches and raised garden beds. I was making slow but steady progress. The torn stitches had been properly repaired by my surgeon, and I had graduated from being mostly bedridden to using Harold's office chair to navigate the apartment. Julia had helped me revoke the power of attorney and secure my remaining finances, though nearly $30,000 remained unaccounted for, withdrawn by Thomas before we could freeze the accounts. I had not heard from my son since that phone call the night of my fall. Part of me had expected some kind of response when the power of attorney was revoked. Anger, perhaps, or attempted justification. But there had been only silence. Until the community dinner. Each Thursday evening, residents gathered in the community room for a potluck meal. Martha, who had been a caterer before retirement, generally coordinated these events with military precision. Frank had convinced me I was well enough to attend, and Harold had helped transport me the short distance in a wheelchair. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed the gathering. The friendly conversation, the genuine interest people showed in each other's lives, the complete lack of pretension. Martha had outdone herself with a chicken casserole that reminded me of holiday meals from my childhood. I was laughing at one of Harold's Vietnam stories when Frank, seated beside me, suddenly stiffened. "Incoming," he muttered, nodding toward the community room entrance. Thomas and Stephanie stood in the doorway, looking dramatically out of place. He in a tailored suit, she in a designer dress that probably cost more than a month's rent for most residents. Their expressions registered clear shock at finding me in such a setting, surrounded by people clearly enjoying my company. "Dad," Thomas said, approaching our table with Stephanie trailing behind, "we have been trying to reach you." "Have you?" I replied calmly, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "I have not received any calls." "We went to your house," Stephanie interjected. "A neighbor said you had not been home since before your surgery. We were worried." The lie was so transparent it was almost laughable. If they had truly been worried, they could have easily called the hospital, checked with my doctor, or simply tried my cell phone, which had been working perfectly fine. "How did you find me?" I asked, genuinely curious. "We called the hospital," Thomas admitted. "Someone there eventually told us a nurse named Angela had helped arrange temporary housing for you." I noticed Angela entering the community room, stopping short when she spotted Thomas and Stephanie. Her expression hardened as she moved to stand protectively near my chair. "We need to talk privately, Dad," Thomas said, glancing uncomfortably at the interested faces around us. "These are my friends," I replied. "Anything you need to say can be said here." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly. "We have been thinking about your situation. We found a really nice assisted living facility that specializes in post-surgical care. We can move you in this weekend." Stephanie stepped forward, her professional smile firmly in place. "It has everything you need, Leonard. 24-hour nursing staff, physical therapy, on-site activities for seniors. We have already put down the deposit." Before I could respond, Julia appeared at my side, having arrived late to the dinner. "Mr. Miller, I brought those documents you asked about." She gave Thomas and Stephanie a cool, assessing look. "I am Julia Kowalski, Mr. Miller's legal advisor." Thomas blinked in surprise, clearly thrown by this development. "Legal advisor, Dad. What is going on?" "I think that is my question," I said, finding strength in the supportive presence surrounding me. "Why did you have me sign a power of attorney without explaining what it was? And why have there been unauthorized withdrawals from my accounts totaling nearly $30,000? Stephanie's smile vanished, replaced by a defensive scowl. "That is ridiculous. Thomas was simply helping manage your finances during your recovery. By transferring my retirement savings into an account I cannot access," I asked. Thomas at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Dad, you are misconstruing things. We were consolidating your assets for better management, and the power of attorney was just a precaution in case decisions needed to be made during your surgery." Julia stepped forward. "Then you will have no objection to returning the withdrawn funds immediately. As Mr. Miller's legal representative, I can provide the proper account information." Thomas's expression hardened. "This is a family matter. I do not know who you people are, or why you are involving yourselves in private affairs between me and my father." Frank rose from his chair, his military bearing making him seem taller than his actual height. "We are the people who picked your father up off the floor when he fell and could not reach you. We are the people who made sure he had meals and medication when you were too busy with dinner parties to care for him after major surgery." A flush of anger crept up Thomas's neck. "You do not understand our situation. We have demanding careers, social obligations. You have a father." Martha interrupted, her grandmotherly appearance belied by the steel in her voice. "A father who raised you alone and gave you everything he had. I would have given anything for more time with my father, before he passed. Stephanie, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, turned to me with barely concealed contempt. "Leonard, this is absurd. You cannot possibly prefer living in this place with these people over a proper care facility. What will our friends think?" Something in me snapped at those words, not in anger, but in clarity. I saw Stephanie fully for who she was, and by extension, who my son had become under her influence. Status-obsessed, image-conscious, and ultimately empty of the values that truly mattered. "Your friends," I said quietly. "I do not care what your friends think. I care what these people think. The ones who showed me more kindness as strangers than my own son did after a lifetime of sacrifice." I turned to Thomas, meeting his eyes directly. "I have revoked the power of attorney. I expect the money you took to be returned within the week, or Julia will pursue legal action. Not because I need the money, but because actions must have consequences." "You would sue your own son?" Thomas asked incredulously. "You would steal from your own father," I countered. Thomas stood speechless, but Stephanie had no such restraint. "This is how you repay us for trying to help you, by surrounding yourself with these nobodies and threatening legal action. Fine. Consider yourself cut off from our lives. Do not expect to be part of our children's lives if we have them. Do not call us when this temporary housing falls through and you need real help." I expected her words to wound me, and they did, but not as deeply as I had feared. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a burden I had been carrying for years had finally been set down. "I wish you well, Thomas," I said, meaning it despite everything. "I truly do. But I will not allow myself to be treated as an inconvenience or a resource to be used and discarded. I deserve better than that. We all do." Thomas hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. For a moment I thought he might break from Stephanie's influence, might remember the values I had tried to instill in him. Instead, he straightened his tie and nodded stiffly. "Goodbye, Dad. Call us if you reconsider the assisted living option." They left without another word, Stephanie's heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor as they exited. The room remained silent for several moments after their departure, until Harold cleared his throat. "Well," he said with deliberate casualness, "Martha, that casserole is not going to serve itself. And I believe Frank was about to tell us about that time in Saigon with the General's Jeep." Just like that, the tension broke. The dinner resumed, people respectfully not mentioning what had just transpired unless I brought it up first. I sat quietly processing the encounter, surprised to find that alongside the inevitable pain was a growing sense of peace, even liberation. I had confronted my greatest fear, being rejected by my only child, and discovered I could survive it. More than survive, I could still find meaning, connection, and even joy beyond that singular relationship that had defined so much of my life. Frank leaned over, speaking quietly. "You okay?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Not yet, but I think I will be." Around me, the warm conversation and laughter of my new community flowed like a healing balm. For the first time since Marie died, I felt truly seen and valued for exactly who I was, not for what I could provide or how I fit into someone else's life plan, but simply for being Leonard. It was enough. I was enough. 6 months passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Spring turned to summer, my back healed better than the doctors had predicted, and I found myself settling into a life I never could have imagined before my surgery. The temporary apartment became permanent when Frank offered me a long-term lease at the same reduced rate. "Good tenants are hard to find," he insisted when I tried to negotiate a more market-appropriate rent. Besides, you have fixed more things around this building than my regular handyman." That was true. As my strength returned, I had discovered that decades of construction knowledge transferred well to maintenance and repair work. What had started as me fixing a leaky faucet in Martha's apartment had evolved into an informal role as building handyman, something that gave me both purpose and community connection. The woodworking classes had been Harold's idea. "We have that storage room in the basement that is just collecting dust," he had pointed out, "and half the residents here have furniture that needs repair." With Frank's permission, I had converted the unused maintenance room into a small woodworking shop, starting with basic tools I already owned and gradually adding more as interest grew. What began as simple repair lessons evolved into a twice-weekly class, where residents created everything from birdhouses to jewelry boxes. The sense of accomplishment on Martha's face when she completed a picture frame for her granddaughter's graduation photo was worth every minute spent teaching proper sanding technique. My relationship with Thomas remained severed. Julia's formal demand for the return of the withdrawn funds had been met with a cashier's check and a cold letter from his attorney containing no personal note or apology. I had deposited the money and closed that chapter, choosing to focus on the present rather than dwell on that painful past. Frank and I had become best friends, our weekly fishing trips to the lake becoming a ritual we both looked forward to. It was during one such trip, sitting in comfortable silence as the sun rose over the water, that Frank had asked if I would consider being his daughter's son's godfather. "Julia's boy is due in September," he explained, focusing intently on his fishing line. "Her husband's family is all overseas, and she thinks the world of you. No pressure, just something to consider." I had been rendered speechless by the request, this unexpected inclusion in a family circle when my own had rejected me. I accepted with a simple nod, too moved for words, and Frank had clapped my shoulder once before returning to our companionable silence. Angela had included me in her family gatherings as well. The first invitation to Sunday dinner had been extended with careful casualness, as though to minimize the significance and allow me an easy way to decline if I wished. I had accepted bringing a homemade apple pie that had been Marie's specialty, the recipe carefully preserved in my memory through decades of recreating it for Thomas's birthdays. Grocery shopping had become one of my regular independent outings using the mobility scooter the store provided until my walking stamina improved. It was during one such trip that I unexpectedly encountered Thomas and Stephanie in the produce section. Our eyes met briefly across a display of apples. Thomas had started to raise his hand in what might have been a greeting, but Stephanie had quickly steered him down another aisle. Surprisingly, the encounter left me more sad than angry. I could see the tension in my son's shoulders, the unhappiness etched around his eyes, despite the expensive clothes and outward trappings of success. I found myself hoping he might someday find his way to authentic happiness, with or without me in his life. Martha had been the one to suggest I share my story at the Senior Center's support group for family estrangement. "Your experience could help others who are going through similar situations," she had pointed out. "Sometimes knowing you are not alone makes all the difference." My first time speaking to the group had been terrifying, my voice shaking as I recounted the hospital abandonment and subsequent discoveries, but the nodding heads and murmurs of understanding had given me courage to continue. By the end, several members had approached with their own stories, thanking me for articulating feelings they had struggled to express. Somehow, I had become something of a mentor figure to others experiencing late-life family rejection. The painful irony was not lost on me, that losing my son had somehow equipped me to help others navigate similar losses. It was not a role I would have chosen, but there was meaning in it, a purpose born from pain. The letter from Thomas's lawyer arrived 3 months after our grocery store encounter. A formal notice contesting my revocation of the power of attorney, claiming I had been unduly influenced by my new associates. Julia had handled it with professional efficiency, her response so thoroughly documented and legally sound that the matter was dropped without further pursuit. They were fishing, she explained, testing to see if you would back down or if you had proper legal representation. They will probably not try again. I had nodded, filing the experience away as the final closing of a door that had been hanging ajar. There was sadness in that finality, but also relief. I was no longer waiting for reconciliation or holding on to false hope. The apartment I now called home had gradually transformed from Frank's generic rental unit to a space that reflected my personality and new life phase. The walls that had once been bare now held photographs, not just old ones of Marie and younger Thomas, but new memories captured with my unexpected late-life community. Frank and me holding up an impressive catch at the lake. The woodworking group proudly displaying their first completed projects. Angela's family Easter dinner with me visible at the end of the table mid-laugh at something her husband had said. For my 74th birthday, a milestone I had once expected to pass with little fanfare, Frank and the others had organized a surprise party in the community room. Harold had wheeled in a cake large enough to feed the entire building. Martha had coordinated a potluck feast featuring favorite dishes from my childhood that I had mentioned in passing conversations. Julia had presented me with a framed ultrasound of her unborn son, my godson-to-be. Speech, someone had called as I stood blinking in surprise at the gathering, looking around at these people who had entered my life through the most painful experience imaginable, and somehow transformed it into something rich with meaning. I had found myself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. I thought I knew what family meant, I finally said. I spent most of my life believing it was defined by blood and obligation. It took losing what I thought I needed to find what I truly deserved. People who choose each other every day, not out of duty, but out of genuine care and respect. As summer turned to early fall, I often sat in the courtyard watching the gardens Martha and several others tended with such care. The perennials they had planted were thriving after their first full season, promising to return year after year with increasing strength and beauty. There was a lesson in those plants, I reflected. Sometimes being uprooted from where you always thought you belonged forces you to be transplanted somewhere new, somewhere you might actually thrive in ways you never could have in familiar soil. Life had not turned out as I expected. The carefully constructed future I had imagined, grandchildren on my knee, holidays with extended family, being cared for in my final years by the son I had sacrificed everything for, had been irrevocably shattered. Yet from those broken pieces, a different mosaic had formed. One with unexpected colors and patterns that, when viewed as a whole, created something perhaps more beautiful than my original vision. A life rich with chosen connections, mutual support, and the dignity of being valued for exactly who I am. For anyone out there facing similar betrayal or abandonment by those who should love you most, I want you to know this healing comes not from clinging to relationships that harm us, but from having the courage to build new ones based on genuine respect and care. Sometimes the family we create in the second acts of our lives proves far more nurturing than the one we were born into or raised. Have you ever had to redefine what family means to you? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey from heartbreak to healing resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories about finding dignity after betrayal. Thank you for accompanying me through this painful but ultimately redemptive chapter of my life. Remember, it is never too late to discover who truly deserves a place in your heart.